everyone, welcome to the June 8th Belmont Stakes edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are going to be looking ahead to Saturday's card at Belmont Park, which is just absolutely loaded with stakes action. In addition to the Grade 1 Belmont Stakes, we have a multitude of graded stakes events, plenty of Grade 1 action leading up to that Belmont. We call it the undercard, but it's really like a Breeders' Cup preview card, Craig. The strongest group of races that we've seen really assembled anywhere in the country from the start of the year right up until the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, this is probably my second favorite day of the year, maybe definitely in the top three between this Derby Day and Breeders' Cup Saturday. Like you said, this feels kind of like a mid-season Breeders' Cup. Most of the top players and all the divisions are here, so it's definitely one of the more fun days that I will have when it comes time to sit down and make the speed figures.
We've already done a preview of the Belmont Stakes itself. You can find that on the Daily Racing Form YouTube channel, where we sort of do a discussion of each runner in the field, and I'm sure we'll go in depth towards the end of this podcast when we get there. But Craig, I will say I like the way that they sequenced this card on Saturday. They put some of the thinner stakes races that have a little more star power, some likely heavy favorites early in the day, not part of the late pick 5 sequence, and we are going to focus on that mandatory payout pick 5 that does end in the Belmont Stakes, races 8 through 12, and they put some pretty difficult races in this sequence, Craig, so the barrier to entry may be a little higher than we're used to on this podcast, because especially in the first two legs, it begins with the Woody Stephens and the Jaipur, fields of 13 and 14 horses, competitive affairs. If you can get through those two, you'll give yourself a chance, but that's not going to be easy.
No, I'll just say I'm a little hazy on if I'm going to play a pick five or not. Sorry, but I couldn't resist the low hanging fruit there with haze. But I'm assuming it's going to be clear by Friday, even though we're recording on Thursday. Seems like everything's pointing in the right direction. I'll be upfront. It's very unlikely I would play a pick five. These races are very difficult, and I will just have a ball playing all of them vertically.
Yeah, you acknowledge the situation with the air quality in the New York City area. We, as you said, we're recording this on Thursday morning. Just recently got the news that they canceled racing on Thursday at Belmont. Sounds like they'll be moving a lot of those races to Sunday. Optimistic that they'll be able to compete on Friday and Saturday when most of the stakes action is scheduled. So we'll operate under that assumption for now, just hoping that things improve between now and then. And Craig, as you said, difficult sequence to put together in terms of a pick 5, just to kind of preview before we start handicapping. As I said, it does begin with the Woody Stephens and Jaipur. The middle leg of this sequence, race 10, is the Metropolitan Handicap, the Met Mile. The Manhattan follows that back on the turf course, and then of course it ends with race 12, the Belmont Stakes. And there's a lot to talk about in these races, Craig, so I think we should just dive right into the handicapping, and we'll begin with that Grade 1 Woody Stephens going the 7 furlong distance for the 3-year-olds. Field of 13 signed on, and I think we have to start by talking about the TimeformUS pace projector in this race, Craig, because there is just so much speed signed on, a multitude of runners that want to be forwardly placed in this race, but they can't all share the lead, so it's going to be interesting to see how horses adapt to this pace situations and which ones find themselves farther back in the pack than they're usually accustomed to.
What's crazy, I mean, just looking at the pace projector, the first thing that jumps out is the 3-horse Arabian Lion is shown back in like ninth, I believe it is. And he's a horse who's been first or second at the first call in every single one of his races, but most of those have been in route races, and he doesn't have any red fractions in his PP. So I know why he's shown back there, but it shows the depth of speed. And I have no argument with the pace projector saying the pace is going to be fast. It seems almost like a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to know even where to begin in a race like this. It's just so competitive. This was one of the toughest races for me to make a morning line on Saturday. Just a lot of these horses stepping up into an unfamiliar situation, and the chaos of the likely pace scenario, it makes it a really difficult race to figure out. I do want to talk about the horses coming out of the Pat Day Mile, Craig, because that's sort of the key race for this Woody Stevens. Multiple contenders coming out of that race on the Kentucky Derby undercard. And General Jim, I feel like, is a horse that will attract plenty of support in this race for a couple of reasons. He obviously took a big step forward last time in that Pat Day Mile, which came up a very fast race, got the job done that day. And he's shown that he can pass horses, which is an attribute that a lot of these runners seem to lack in the Woody Stevens, or it's just an attribute they haven't had to show yet. And at least we know that General Jim can come from just off the pace. The problem with General Jim, though, Craig, is given that running style, preferring to race in a stalking position or mid-pack, while he's had to pass a couple horses or maybe 3 or 4 horses in recent starts, he's shown back in, I think, 12th or 13th on the pace projector, so he could find himself much farther back than he's accustomed to, but he's still a horse that seems to be on the upswing for a trainer that can be pretty dangerous when his horses get into form.
Yeah, I have no problem with General Jim other than he's the morning line favorite, and I have no reason to doubt your line. I suspect he will be the favorite as they go off, and it's just a race I'm not sure I want to take a low price on, particularly from a horse who's probably going to be at the back of the pack. He did win the Pat Day Mile, but that race is a furlong longer than what this one is. He's turning back in distance, and even though none of the fractions were coded in red that day, it was a race that definitely had a flow from the back of the pack. None of the speeds were around at the end.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And given that situation from the Pat Day, I think you have to upgrade the number 8, Fort Bragg, who I kind of view as the horse to beat in this race. He's one of 2 Bob Baffert trainees in this field. I did peg Arabian Lion as a slightly shorter price on the morning line. I guess we'll see how they bet it. But Fort Bragg, I thought, ran the best race in the Pat Day because he was up close, attacking that pace, racing on the outside, forged to the front at the top of the stretch, and it looked like General Jim was going to blow right by him at about the 8th pole, but Fort Bragg fought that one all the way to the wire in what I thought was a game effort. And Craig, I've always wanted to see this horse going shorter rather than longer. I know they tried some Derby preps, but I think that the one-turn races really suit him, and we'll just see if he can work out a trip coming from a little further off the pace this time.
Yeah, that's a concern I have with him, but I'm with you. I like him a lot in this spot. My one concern is he's done all of his best running pretty close to the lead, and I'm not sure he's going to be there. If he finds himself very close like he did in the Pat Day Mile, it could be trouble late, but I suspect he can run in mid pack. I mean, he showed when he broke his maiden in a route race, he was able to sit back in third, so I think it's pretty likely, and he's a horse that may be overlooked because, as you said, with the other Bab Baffert, with General Jim in here, they're probably going to take more money, almost assuredly going to take more money.
And just note, while there's a blinker change noted on Fort Bragg, if you watch that Pat Day Mile, he was wearing cheek pieces in that race, which create a very similar effect to blinkers, so it's really not that big of a change from his last race, just a minor detail to note on him. Craig, we already touched on him a little bit, but what do you make of the other Bob Baffert trainee, Arabian Lion? In terms of natural talent, I think he ranks up there near the top with some of the major contenders in this race. But he's just a horse that I always have trouble warming up to because if you watch all of his races, he can be a little faint-hearted. I mean, he's obviously gifted, but he's been most effective when he can sort of control things or get a perfect trip, and he just might not have that coming to him in this race.
No, I mean, if you're talking about getting a perfect trip, he had it in the Sir Barton race, which he towered over as it was on paper. There wasn't a lot of competition speed figure wise. And given the pace advantage that he had, I mean, he was able to just set a tepid pace. He was all by himself. So he just feels like to me the kind of horse that you have to take a shot against because he just usually has things go his own way. And even when he does, it's not like he's always produced. He's a horse that's only won 2 of the 6 times he's been sent out. He always takes a lot of money. And yeah, I just think his reputation is better than what his actual results are.
Well, we've covered the runners that I think are going to be the 3 shortest prices in this race, but if you want to shop for a bigger price, you certainly have the opportunity to do so in a race like this. Craig, who else were you looking at? Because there are so many ways to go in this race, so many fast horses. Who was intriguing you?
A horse that really intrigues me is the horse drawn on the far outside in Drew's Gold. The one concern is that he is kind of a speed horse, but he's also shown the ability to rate off the pace. He gets a good outside speed position, and as the guy that does the Timeform US speed figures, it's impossible for me to ignore that 123 that he ran last time. Obviously, it was against weaker competition in the Gold Fever. Haven't seen a lot of runbacks in there, but the runner-up in that race, Creek, he's a pretty good horse who has run some good speed figures. And Drew's Gold made him just look like a totally inferior horse that day. And he's one I think could get overlooked. And if he were drawn to the inside, I wouldn't like his chances at all. But being drawn on the outside, I'm going to give him a long look.
Yeah, he was so impressive last time out. And like you said, the outside post position could work to his advantage because he's probably not going to have to deal with that kickback, even if he is a little outrun to the front end, which could very well be the case given how much speed is signed on here. He was a horse that had a lot of trouble getting out of the gate in his first couple of starts, but it seems like he's gotten over those problems the last two times. He's broken much better. And if he can run a complete race like he did last time, he could be a real handful in here. I'm intrigued to see how he does because it is a step up in class, like you said, but he showed a lot of talent in that last race. Craig, I often try to find some turnbacks in a race like this, and there are some to choose from in here. One that does interest me is the number 11 Victory Formation, who is typically the kind of horse that I would like a lot in the Woody Stevens, one that initially showed talent sprinting, tried to stretch out, get onto the Derby trail. It didn't quite work out, didn't run so well in the Risen Star when he failed to make the front end. Better last time in the Bathhouse Row, although was kind of surprised to see him even show up in that race going 9 furlongs, since that seems to really be pushing his stamina to the limit. I think turning back to 7 really works for Victory Formation. He's just another one where I worry about what kind of trip he's going to get because he's never really shown that dimension to come from off the pace, but he's probably going to have to do it in this race.
Yeah, it's a question mark for these horses for sure. He's one that's done all of his best running on the front end. When he doesn't run well, he backs up in the stretch, but sometimes it's hard to get a read on those things. His last two races have been at a mile and an eighth, and he's obviously a more mature horse now. So maybe he would have the ability to lay in like fifth or sixth and just sit outside horses and make a run. So I don't want to totally dismiss him in here. I'm looking at some price horses and another price horse I'm interested to get your take in here, and he's probably the wild card of wild cards, is the one horse New York Thunder. He's a horse who's run fast. He's quick out of the gate, but he hasn't done it on dirt. We've seen him win 5 furlong races on turf and synthetic. Last time he won a 6 furlong stake as easily as a horse can win up at Woodbine. He won the Woodstock Stakes, so he's just a real wild card for me. It seems like he's going to be in a bit tough drawn inside, probably going to have to go way faster than he ever has, but I could understand people who might think he'd be worth a shot in here.
Yeah, I mean, his presence basically ensures that this pace is going to be hot because, I mean, he has to go from the inside if he breaks sharply, and he's been a horse that has been able to get out of the gate clearly in his recent starts. Watching his races, he gives me strong vibes of being a turf synthetic sprinter. I'm not saying anything too clever there. That's all he's done so far. But just, being by Nyquist out of the midshipman mare, the Dams family, the Dams a half to a horse that was much more of a turf synthetic type. And, we'll see if he handles the dirt. The Nyquist tend to be pretty versatile. But to me, he just looks like a smaller, compactly built horse that might struggle with the 7 furlongs anyway, and especially trying to do it on the dirt could be a tall order for him, but he probably is going to be in front for at least a portion of this race, and that could make life difficult for some of the other lightly raced runners that are trying to step up in a race like this, Craig. I mean, what do you make of horses like the number 6 Harrodsburg or the number 7 Federal Judge, who has run really fast against Maiden and Allowance Company, but will be getting this class test, and are two that want to show speed?
Harrodsburg, I wouldn't be as high on. I just don't think he's as good as Federal Judge, and he's a speed horse. Federal Judge is a little more tricky because he's run better speed figures, but it just seems like his work's really going to be cut out for him in his third lifetime start. Granted, the third place finisher in his last race, Deer District, came back to win with a much improved speed figure. I think he ran a 115 winning his race last time. So Federal Judge is legit. It just seems like this might be too tough of a step so early in his career.
Yeah, I agree. Federal Judge seems like one of the most talented horses in this race. It's hard to see him working out an ideal trip here, but he does have the speed to at least get forward, and we'll see if he can withstand the pace. Given the situation, Craig, I am always trying to look for a horse that can take advantage if this race happens to come apart, and I was trying to look for some options at bigger prices that could fit that bill. I suppose you can make a case for a horse like the number 12 Gilmore, who was closing at the end of the Pat Day Mile, though he got paced to close into that day and still couldn't beat General Jim and Fort Bragg, so I couldn't get too excited about him, and I ended up going towards a horse that I set at a gigantic price on the morning line, and I think he's going to be close to that, but just one that I think might be able to sit the right trip in this race, and that's the number 9 Fort Warren. And look, this horse has a lot to prove. He's stepping way up in class, but this is a horse that showed some real ability when he made his debut for Bob Baffert last year. That was a strong debut race where he beat Spun Intended, who came back to win again. I mean, Johannes, who ended up being better on the turf, was in there. Multiple other horses from that race have panned out to be okay. And something just obviously went wrong with him. I mean, he didn't take any money in that 4-horse San Vicente. That was basically a 3-horse race among the Bob Baffert trainees. Just felt like he didn't train on after that. They subsequently switched him away from Bob Baffert, sent him to Brittany Russell, obviously, lowering expectations a little bit. But Brittany Russell has done okay with some of these horses that she's gotten from these owners, including the Grade 1 Carter upsetter Doppelganger. And this horse got a confidence builder last time at Pimlico. Watching that race, I really liked the way that he rated and then finished once he was peeled to the outside in the stretch. He was really motoring through the wire, and that horse that he ran down, Johnny Z from Albany, he's not a bad horse. And stretching out to the 7 feels like it's going to suit this son of Curlin, and just feels like one that has proven he can pass horses and finish, and is going to be a gigantic price. So he's one that I have to use in this race.
Yeah, I mentioned in the beginning I would play all of these races vertically, and he's a horse I'd be interested in. And just one other, I can't remember. We've probably talked about every horse in the field or darn near it, but the number 2 Gun Pilot is another horse who I think, given his inside draw, I could see him dropping back, just saving ground. I thought last time in the Pat Day Mile, he may have been a little too close from that outside post. They were kind of trying to get position. It didn't really work out, and he kind of flattened out in the lane, but I think if he reverted to more tactics where he's more towards the back of the pack saving ground, he could also get into things late at a big price.
Yeah, Gun Pilot does have that late pace flag on the TimeformUS pace projector on the new TimeformUS, which something to often pay attention to in races like this where the pace is projected to be so fast. Haven't loved his last 2 races, but like you said, maybe the turn back and the hot pace is going to work to his favor. Let's move on to another incredibly difficult race. The 9th race is the Grade 1 Jaipur, and we've got an oversubscribed field here. 14 will run in this race. We've got 2 on the also eligible list, and this one's a real skullbuster, Craig. I mean, there are so many ways to go. I do think that, unlike in the Woody Stevens, at least we have a couple of clearly defined favorites in here, or that's how I was viewing it, in the number 12 Caravel, who has just been on a tear recently, obviously winning the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint last year and continuing her win streak since then, and also the number 11 Casa Creed, who has just been a specialist in this race. He's won it the last 2 years, will be seeking his 3rd Jaipur victory in a row. They seem like the 2 that you really have to get around, but they both have questions to answer. Caravel with regard to the pace situation, and Casa Creed coming back off another layoff.
There's definitely some other speed in here, so I'll just be upfront. I'm going to try to beat Caravel for about the 27th straight time. I have had some success doing that, but it's clearly been a while as she's been on a tear of late. Running big speed figures at shorter distances. She's had success going longer before, but it just feels like maybe she's finally met a field that may be too tough, and she's just not going to get things her own way on the front end.
Yeah, I'm viewing her the same way. I mean, in retrospect, she was kind of fortunate in that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. Look, I know she ran a big race at 42-1, and she took advantage of the situation, but Golden Pal missed the break that day. aside from him, there wasn't really the speed to go with her, and she was able to set an even pace the entire way. And since then, I think she's run well in both starts this year, but this field just came up significantly tougher than both the Shakertown and the Unbridled Sydney, where she beat the likes of Bad Beat Brian and Bay Storm. This is just a better race than that. She's drawn outside. There's other speed. Just feels like this is probably the right time to take a shot against Caravel if she's anything close to that 3-1 morning line. I have more optimism about Casa Creed, Craig, just because we've seen him do this before. It's a very similar pattern to last year when he went overseas to contest that turf sprint in Saudi Arabia and actually stayed there a little longer last year to run in the Alcoz sprint in Dubai, and then came back and obviously was so effective to win that Jaipur once again. And then this year, I thought even though he fell short in that turf sprint in Saudi Arabia again, when I go back and watch that race, he ran huge that day, was outside around the turn, covered ground, still almost got to that quality Japanese rival. So seems like at least back in February, he was still maintaining excellent form, and he is just so effective in the 6 and 7 furlong turf sprints at Belmont.
Yeah, I've had luck with him in this race, and I'm not abandoning him here. I just can't get past this feeling that he's the best horse in the race, particularly at this 6 furlong distance. We've seen it from him before. He seems to have held his form. He's 7 years old now on turf. I don't think that's any issue at all, as no sign of decline from his race in Saudi Arabia. I think he'll be able to work out a trip from the 11 post that shouldn't pose a problem at Big Belmont Park. So he's the horse to beat for me, even more so than Caravel.
Yeah, I will say when he won this race last year, he got an absolutely perfect ground saving trip. We'll see if he can work out the same thing this year from the outside post, but he is a major, major contender. I agree. Where else are we going in here, Craig? Because there are many other directions we could take. I think a horse like Big Invasion is one that we should discuss because there are a few coming out of that turf sprint on the Churchill Downs Derby week when it was upset by no balls, and obviously some horses had to not show up for a long shot like that to win, but there were also some trips in that race. First and foremost among them, Big Invasion, who just was never really in the right spot under Joel Rosario, and one that I'm sure Rosario would like to do over, just constantly making the wrong choices with this horse. He's obviously better than that, but I wonder if he could get back to that stellar form that we saw out of him as a 3-year-old, because it's been now a couple races where he hasn't quite run as fast as we had seen from him last year.
Yeah, I actually think that's a good thing. I like him quite a bit in here, and if I play exactas, it will probably be him and Casa Creed. I think he's had some excuses this year. One, that 5 furlongs at Gulfstream, not really suited to his running style, and he still was able to get past a pretty tough customer. And Yes, I Am Free, who just loves that Gulfstream course. Not really a graded stakes type horse, but just a really fast horse who always does well on that 5 furlong races there. And then, as you said, his last trip was an absolute nightmare. He comes in here third off the layoff, and I think there's every reason to expect he can get back to and even run better than what we saw last year. He ran a couple 118s in July and August at Saratoga. It was good form that he had carried over from Belmont, where he had won the Paradise Creek very easily. And I just think he's kind of has really dirtied up form and has a lot more to show that we haven't seen so far in 2023.
Now, Craig, based on your comments on those two, I'm guessing that you think this pace is really going to heat up. I mean, we haven't talked about it too much. I guess we mentioned it with regard to Caravel, but I mean, both Big Invasion and Costa Creed are going to need some help up front because they're each deep closers in this large field. There is some speed signed on. I'll be interested to see how fast they really do go up front, though.
Yeah, the one thing is it is 6 furlongs, so maybe they'll slow it down a little, but then they got to get that extra half or 1 furlong in some cases. And Caravel and Nothing Better both really just want to lead. Neither one of them have shown a whole lot of interest in coming from off the pace. I mean, Caravel, I guess, can rate a little bit, but she's usually right up there when she's not on the front. It's usually going pretty quick. So I do think things could get pretty hot just between those two. The interesting thing on the pace projector is we show Arrest Me Red in third, and he's a horse who hasn't particularly shown much speed at all since the Breeders' Cup. He's had 2 chances this year, and I wonder if maybe they aren't going to try to get back to tactics where he's more forwardly placed because coming from off of it hasn't worked at all.
Yeah, Craig, when I was initially looking at this race, I was kind of assuming that it would collapse. But as I started to analyze the pace a little more, I was coming around to the idea that maybe there's not as much pace in this field as I originally thought. Because when you do have horses in that third and fourth spot, like, Air Force Red and Arrest Me Red, I mean, they both have some speed, but neither one of them needs to be in front. And Air Force Red is basically controlled races in California when the paces are slow. Not expecting that to happen here, so I think he might have to rate. And Arrest Me Red, like you were saying, he's just lost some of that quickness that he had in recent starts. So I don't really view him as a pace player in here. And once you start to go through horse by horse, it really does feel like Nothing Better and Caravel are going to get out to the front. Now, with Caravel drawn outside, I highly doubt that she's going to be quick enough to clear Nothing Better, who is a really quick horse, but that makes me want to take a long look at Nothing Better, because I do think he's going to be able to get to the front here. I think he's fast enough to clear horses like Air Force Red and Arrest Me Red, and this horse gets pretty brave when he gets to the lead. And just looking at Nothing Better's recent races, I know that he hasn't run in against a field of this quality really ever before, but he is just a hard-trying horse who always shows up. He's always in a fight to the finish, trying hard at the ends of his races. We saw that attribute last time in that turf sprint at Pimlico, where he got collared by Beer Can Man in mid-stretch and just never gave up, coming down to the finish, trying to battle back on that rival, pulling well clear of the rest of the field. I thought he was also super game two back at Aqueduct when he took pace pressure, put away that field, and held off the closers late. I just think this horse is doing really well right now. And as I started to go through this race more and more, I wasn't so convinced that the race had to fall apart. And I think there's a real chance Nothing Better could wire this field.
I can see that. I just wonder how soon Caravel will challenge him. Maybe she can't clear him. But at some point, I would be much more optimistic if it was a shorter race. It just seems like to me at some point he's going to face some challenges, and it will be before the stretch, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I guess my feeling on that is maybe he's better equipped for the 6 furlongs than she is, even though she's won going this far before. She's more of like that 5.5 specialist, whereas Nothing Better's been effective going longer in the past. So we'll see how that plays out, but I know he's going to be a better price than Caravel, so I'm pretty interested in him. And I mean, there are other places to go in here, Craig. I mean, I think the number 5, Dr. Zemph, might be a little bit of a wise guy horse for some, because he's a turn back in this race, one that really had no chance setting the pace in that Maker's Mark last time against Chez Pierre, who looks so formidable early in this day in the poker. And sprinting could be what this horse wants to do. He just has to get faster.
Yeah, I'm not sure if sprinting's what he wants to do, if Chad Brown thinks that's what he wants to do, or if he's just kind of taking a chance because he showed after that allowance win in the Maker's Mark that he's really not anywhere near a grade one horse going a mile. So maybe just taking a shot in a grade one here feels like he's probably a bit over his head. And I don't really like turnbacks as much on the turf as, blue fractions on the turf are usually quite a bit slower than what they're going to face sprinting.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. He's a horse that has been a little headstrong, so I think that also goes into the thinking that turning back might allow him to relax a little more. But we'll see how far back he ends up being on this cutback to 6 furlongs. Craig, sounds like you like a couple of horses in this race in Big Invasion and Casa Creed. Is there anybody else outside of those that you were looking at?
No, not particularly. I finally divorced Arrest Me Red. I'm not betting him anymore. It's just that I think he's lost a little bit of speed. Maybe someone would be interested in Air Force Red. He's kind of has that profile of a horse who could turn back. He's won down the hill at Santa Anita before, but I'm not sure he's quite good enough to handle this kind of company.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out one crazy long shot who is not my top pick, but just a horse that I want to use somewhere, especially in exotics in this race. And that's the number 7, Thin White Duke, who I know looks a little slow on recent speed figures, but he's now third off a layoff this year. And he showed some real quality in a few races last year, particularly that Troy Stakes at Saratoga, where he made that big late run to almost upset Golden Pal that day. And subsequently held his form pretty well, achieved a stakes victory through towards the middle portion of the season. Came back this year and was in that race that was wired by Nothing Better at Aqueduct. Probably just needed that start off the layoff. And then last time, it's a trip worth watching in the elusive quality. It was just not the finest ride. He was in an uncomfortable position at multiple points in the race. Had to alter course at the top of the stretch fairly awkwardly, and was actually finishing at the end that day. And this is a horse that probably wants to go shorter than the 7 furlongs anyway, and he's getting a big rider upgrade here to Javier Castellano. So just one that is probably going to be every bit of that 30-1 that I think can make an impact late on this race, and we'll see how good if he's good enough to really get into the top three or not. But he's one that I definitely want to have on my ticket somewhere. Let's move on to the 10th race, Craig. Not the feature race, but a race that I know a lot of people are looking forward to on this Belmont Stakes undercard. The Met Mile, the Grade 1 Metropolitan Handicap, going the 1 turn mile distance. And we obviously have a real star in this race in the number 1, Cody's Wish, who has gained such a fan following based on the story around him, and also the fact that he just keeps winning races, and it seems like his reputation just keeps growing with every subsequent victory. And he was obviously really impressive last time in that Churchill Down Stakes, but the disparity in quality between that race and this Met Mile is pretty wide. This is a big step up for Cody's Wish. Obviously, he's run in some tough spots before and been successful, but he just feels like a horse that probably, if anything, is going to drift down from my 7-5 morning line, and I'm not sure I want to take that short a price on anybody in that race as tough as this one.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong field. I don't love the rail draw for him, even though he's a horse who's probably going to drop back anyway. We have him next to last in the pace projector, which does say it's going to be a fast pace, so maybe that'll be to his benefit. But I agree, he's really good. I mean, obviously, he won the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. He's done nothing wrong in quite a long time. I just don't know if I want to take even money or so on a horse like this in a race that's this competitive.
Yeah, and he does have some real rivals in this race, unlike last time, horses that have run comparable speed figures to him. And I think we have to talk about the number 7, Repo Rocks, Craig, who, I mean, if he shows up with his best effort, I mean, even Cody's Wish could be in trouble in this race, because his performances in the Toboggan and the Westchester, I mean, I don't know where they came from, but I know that they were awesome performances. And if he runs it here, he's a potential Met Mile winner, as unlikely as that might seem, given the horse that he was, a year ago. He's coming in off just a super impressive performance where he crushed Zandon, who some people consider to be a contender in this race. What do we do with him?
Well, I know what I'm going to do with him, and maybe it's silly, but I can't bet this horse, and I'm kind of banking on one thing, and it's that his two big performances came in Grade 3 races. The one time he was in a Grade 1, the Carter, even though he ran second, he didn't look like the same horse that day. I still don't know how he got second. He looked like he was done on the turn. I'm not going to try to figure out Jamie Ness. I know we all have our thoughts about Jamie Ness, but I just wonder in a Grade 1 if he's going to show up with the same type of race we saw in a race like the Westchester or the Toboggan, because he just didn't look the same to me in the Carter, and I'm kind of counting that that's the one that's going to show up in the Met Mile. I just can't bring myself to bet him, so maybe it's wishful thinking.
Yeah, I guess another argument with him is that he just hasn't put those gigantic speed figures back to back just yet. And, he followed up that Toboggan with a couple of regressions. And then last time in the Westchester, I mean, he got back to that explosive race, but can he do it now twice in a row, whereas he wasn't able to before? I think that's a big question with Repo Rocks. But look, I mean, I watched back that Westchester multiple times. This horse came around the far turn with his ears pricked, like he was just toying with the competition. Good horses in that race. I mean, if he runs that race again, he's going to win this Met Mile. I'm not sure he can do it, but he's not a horse that I want to let beat me in this spot, because I don't think he's going to be that short a price. I could actually see him drifting up from that 4-1, and he is a horse that I think is very dangerous in this spot. Craig, where else would you be looking in this race? Because there are plenty of others to consider, horses with back class, runners that have been going either shorter or longer that might appreciate this 1 turn mile. So who was interesting you?
Well, I'll just talk about a few horses. Some I like, some I don't. I actually want to give Zandon another shot, assuming Repo Rocks doesn't run the same race that he ran in the Westchester. That was his first race off a pretty long layoff. He ran a good speed figure that day. He was wide on the turn. I just thought he probably wasn't fully cranked up for that spot, and maybe this is the one for him. So I definitely want to give him a shot in here. Charge It is a horse who will probably take some money. I think it's time for me to write off Charge It. I kind of have already, to be honest, after he lost to Endorsed in a race that hasn't come back very strong. Um, he ran that huge Timeform US speed figure. I think he ran a huge buyer as well. Some might question the figure. I don't think it's so much the figure is just something went wrong with the horse. I don't, whatever it was that sent them to the sidelines, it seems he's lost a little bit on the racetrack. So I think his reputation will drive him to take some money, but I'm just not interested in him at all in this spot. One horse I am interested in and that is coming off a layoff is a horse that seems to get overlooked every single time he steps on the track, and that's Slow Down Andy, the two horse. He's listed as 10-1 on your line. I think it's a good line. I think he could go up a little. I think he could go down a little. But I think this is a horse with some real abilities, especially at the 1 mile distance. So I don't want to totally dismiss him at 10-1.
Yeah, there are definitely many ways to go in this race. And, when I was first going through it, Craig, I was kind of leaning in the same direction as you, that maybe this race just fits Zandon really well. He is a horse that wants to make that big run from off the pace, and he arguably hasn't gotten the right pace situations to set it up in some recent starts. But he's just, and we've talked about this, Craig, I think particularly when we were discussing the Cigar Mile last year, that he's a horse that in every race, I want to see him show a little bit more than he does. He's just kind of been settling for minor awards in a few spots, and he'll get there in mid-stretch and then just hang a little bit. And, he did it going longer, thought that turning back would be the key for him, but now he's done it in both races going shorter, the Cigar Mile and the Westchester. And yeah, you can make excuses, sloppy track coming off a layoff, but he's just a horse that I'm starting to get a little bit tired of. And, it feels like he's not going to be that big a price in this race. It's probably, around the second or third choice. So I ultimately had trouble warming up to him and wanted to go in some different directions. And I'm actually going to take the opposite view of you, Charge It. I know maybe he's just not the same horse. That's always a possibility because, like you said, that Dwyer performance from last year was totally legitimate. I mean, if you look at the runbacks from that race, there's an argument that 132 or 133 Timeform US speed figure should actually be higher. I mean, horses have come back out of that race to actually improve. This year, he just hasn't looked quite the same. What I will say is that I don't think going longer has ever been the answer for this horse. I know he's got a pedigree that says more distance might suit him, but just given his physical characteristics and attributes, I think he's one that is much better suited to one-turn races. And, it's a little bit of a concern that he did not run well in the Gulfstream Park Mile 2 back, but last time at Oaklawn, that was just a perplexing spot for him. It was the wrong spot. I mean, they put the blinkers on. He got too rank and keen in the early stages, was sort of hopping down the back stretch as Luis Saez was leaning back in the saddle, and then he got to lugging in the stretch and was cut off by another horse at the eighth pole, which cost him some momentum and just looked like a horse that still was, falling back on those unprofessional tendencies. This time, it's a different kind of race, and I find it interesting that Todd Pletcher has elected to keep the blinkers on. I would have been sure there'd be a blinker change after the last race, but maybe that's signaling that aggression that he showed last time, they're actually thinking it could be an asset in this race, because there's some speed signed on, but it's not necessarily front-running speed. I guess Dr. Chevel is going to go to the lead, and he'll be trying to stretch his sprint speed to a mile, so we'll see how that works out. But Charge It has the natural speed to be right on top of that horse early, and I don't think they're going to get so aggressive with a confirmed stalker like Repo Rocks. So I think Charge It is going to get a very similar trip to the one that he worked out when he put in that fantastic Dwyer performance, and he's just one of these horses that wants to go fast. You can see he's keen. He wants to run fast from the start of his races. And when you let a horse that's naturally fast get into that kind of rhythm, they can tend to get comfortable and keep running along at that pace. And we saw that happen in the Dwyer. Maybe he's not capable of that anymore, but I'm going to take the optimistic view on him because he's finally going to be a better price, a much better price than he's been in those recent starts where he's been, such a prohibitive favorite. So I'm going to take the positive view of Charge It. As for Slow Down Andy, I get it, Craig. I mean, he did not run that much worse than Cody's Wish in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile last year, and it felt like he was on this steep upward trajectory at that point. He had kind of run well, surprisingly, in the Awesome Again. Didn't know where that came from, but then he moved forward once again in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. Coming off the layoff, it's a question. Doug O'Neill has okay numbers coming off layoffs like this, actually a little more positive than you might expect. And I watched some of his recent workouts in XBTV. It seems like he's doing well coming into this race. It's a tall order, but I do think he's going to be a fair price. So some interesting things going on with him.
Yeah, and I guess let's just talk about the rest of them. You briefly mentioned Dr. Scheibel. I think this might be a little too much for him. He looked okay last time. He got a 123 time form speed figure, but that one got a big pace upgrade. He's not really a horse who's done a lot of running on the front end. He's pretty versatile. He does it all, but it just seems like a big step up to me from beating CZ Rocket, a horse who's now gotten two mentions on this forecast. But it just seems like a big jump up to me. Hoist the Gold, he was second to Cody's Wish last time. Hard to envision a scenario where he's able to turn the tables on that one. Who beat him so easily last time? And Doppelganger, he won that Carter. Seemed like just a total dream trip to me. Still would have to improve to beat some of the others in here. So he's going to be a big price. If he gets a meltdown, maybe some could use him in underneath spots. Hard for me to see him winning. And then what do you do with White Abarrio? If it was still Safi Joseph, I probably wouldn't use the horse as he has most of his success. But in the newly returned Richard Dutchrow barn, I'm not sure what to do with him because his last race was pretty good.
Yeah, his last race was good. I guess the problem with that is that it was all the way back at the beginning of March, and it was also a race where I felt that the rail was really not the place to be at Gulfstream on March 4th. That was, I believe, Fountain of Youth Day, and he was outside the entire way. I thought very much got the right trip in that spot, and since then, I mean, they've targeted two races that he's missed for different reasons. He was entered in the Carter, was scratched from that race with an illness. He was entered to run against Cody's Wish in the Churchill Downs, was scratched from that race due to the situation around Safi Joseph on Derby Week. And like you said, now he's coming back in the Rick Dutrow barn. Maybe that's reason to think he's going to improve, but I think he really would have to improve because I've never really viewed him as this kind of horse, Craig, from a quality standpoint, even though I do think that the 1 turn mile is probably the right distance for him.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't particularly like him. I was just wondering, and some might look at his last race and think it's a key race because Wayburn came back to win, Collaborate came back to win, but it was a case where they both basically ran the same speed figures they ran that day. Neither have gone on to improve, so that's kind of where I wouldn't really consider it a key race, even with the 2-3 finishers winning.
Let's move on to the Grade 1 Manhattan, back over to the turf course, going the 1.25 mile distance on the inner course at Belmont Park. And Craig, it's a 10-horse field. I think there are some runners in here that are probably a little tough to make a case for, some that just don't seem to have the quality, others that want to go a little bit longer. And we do have formidable presences of a couple of Charlie Appleby trainees and also Up to the Mark, who has just been in such fantastic form for trainer Todd Pletcher and was so impressive winning that Turf Classic on Derby Day last time out. And I guess the big question with Up to the Mark is stretching out to the 1.25 mile distance, but if you think he can handle it, he's going to be a handful in this race.
I'm watching his races. I don't really see any reason to think he couldn't handle it. I mean, the one time he was beaten was when he turned back in that Maker's Mark. It was a race that didn't really set up for him at all that day. There wasn't a lot of pace. Shapier kind of ran away from everybody. And I thought did good. He almost beat Modern Games for second. The mile and 1/8 seemed to be right up his alley. Now, granted, that wasn't the strongest field, beating horses like Hong Kong Harry and Spooky Channel, who are good horses, but I wouldn't say they're really grade one type horses. But I don't really see any knocks on this horse at all. He's got the figures. Um, I don't think the distance is going to be a problem. How did you view that step up to 10 furlongs?
Yeah, I'm not that concerned about it. Like you said, I mean, the mile two back was arguably a little sharp for him, and obviously the pace maybe didn't work out. And you could also maybe argue that Irad Ortiz was a little too overconfident around the far turn and sort of didn't sense, that Shea Pierre had basically broken the race open and gotten away from the field at that point. And I mean, this horse really did some running in the late stages of that Maker's Mark. You can't see it on the replay because of we were just zoomed in on a solo shot of the winner. I mean, but he basically hit the wire with Modern Games, who has come back to win a tough Group 1 in Europe. So, I mean, there's real quality with Up to the Mark, at least based on the evidence of that form line. And like you said, he was not beating the strongest field last time in the Turf Classic, but when you win a turf race by nearly 4 lengths, you're just in a different league than your competition. And I mean, it's not like he saved ground that day. He was outside on both turns, 2 to 3 wide, and just still mowed that field down. Some might point to a little bit of sprint pedigree on the bottom side, but this is a horse who's already outrunning his pedigree. I mean, he's not really bred to be a confirmed turf horse, and he has just turned into a completely different horse on this surface. A different running style, the speed that he showed sprinting on debut, he's now been able to harness that speed and translate it to finishing speed in his races going longer. So just a horse that seems to have that mental capacity to basically ration out his turn of foot the way that he does. I think that bodes well for him to get this 1.25 mile distance. And Craig, to be honest, I know there are a couple of Charlie Appleby runners in this field, and I guess that leads some to believe this is a tougher race because Charlie Appleby just wins so many races in this country. But among the other American trainees in this race, it's not really a tougher race than the Turf Classic. I just think it's a matter of whether or not you think these two Charlie Appleby runners are going to be a real thorn in the side of Up to the Mark.
I agree with you. A lot of these horses are turning back in distance. The American horses from a mile and a half, horses like Red Knight, Soldier Rising, Rock Emperor, who ran a mile and an eighth last time, but he's been running a mile and a half, mile and 3/8 most of his career. So, if anything, it seems like the 1.25 miles might be too short. And I'm not sure they're good enough anyway for a horse like Up to the Mark. So, for me, it kind of comes down to him and the two Charlie Appleby horses. And for me, I'm just not sure how good those Charlie Appleby horses are. I think maybe winning has come so easy. He's trying to send maybe some even lesser stock over here than he has in the past. And they're fine horses. Obviously, Ottoman Fleet ran good last time. He ran a good speed figure, but I don't know that he's better than Up the Mark. Now, I mean, I'm trying to make a big case for a horse you have 8 to 5 on the morning line, but I actually think he is just much the most likely winner, honestly, because Warren Point, the other Charlie Appleby, I wasn't impressed by him at all. He went off 3 to 5 and was just run by pretty easily to finish way back. Well, not way back. He was beating a length and 3/4, but he really packed it in the last probably 100 yards or so in that race.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the inclination is to say that Ottoman Fleet is the preferred one because the stable's go-to jockey William Buick is showing up on him, and he won the prep race. And his European form is arguably a slight step above Warren Point. They actually faced off in a race at Newbury last September, where Ottoman Fleet did edge out Warren Point. They finished second and third to I think another one of their stablemates in that race. And since then, Ottoman Fleet has progressed a little bit, ran some nice races in Dubai, and his most recent race at Newmarket in April, he showed a really impressive turn of foot to win that Group 3 event. His race in the Fort Marcy, Craig, I thought was okay. I think he might be getting a little overrated off that performance because, I mean, he beat Tide of the Sea and City Man, who are decent horses, but I mean, you don't really view them as contenders in a race like the Manhattan. And he also got an absolutely perfect trip to win that race. I mean, Tide of the Sea arguably did a lot more work than he did, setting that pace on the front end. They were going a decent clip. We've got those fractions color-coded red in TimeformUS, and Ottoman Fleet reeled that one in, but it's not like he was, significantly drawing away at the end. So he's okay. I would tend to veer more in the direction of Warren Point if I was going to upgrade one of these Charlie Appleby runners, just because I think he was overrated in the Man of War last time, so I'm not going to hold it against him that he lost at 3 to 5 because he never should have been 3 to 5. But beyond that, I mean, he just did not get a great trip in that race. I mean, blowing the brake, that was obviously of his own doing, and maybe he's just a horse that's not great out of the gate. But after that, I mean, it seemed like Frankie Dettori had trouble settling him into a spot. He was wide around the first turn, made a premature move down the backstretch, no cover, continued wide around the far turn. You just can't win a Grade 1 race with that kind of trip, and he came up short in the end. I think the turn back to 1.25 miles is fine for him. He's going to be overlooked, being the much better price of these two. So I'd be more willing to upgrade him. But I kind of come back to what you were saying, that I just think Up to the Mark is in great form right now, and I didn't see a big reason to take a shot against him. So I'd probably lean on him in the pick 5 sequence and use Warren Point as the main backup.
I agree with you on the Applebee's. I probably wasn't very clear on that. Of the two, he's going to offer much better value. And I don't think there's a whole lot of difference between them. The only other horse I wanted to mention that I might consider if I was going to play a pick 5 as a C type horse would be the Two Strong Quality, just because we've seen so many of these races where you're going a long distance and they kind of forget about pace in these races. And even though the pace projector has him back in second, the 9 horse who's shown in first hasn't shown a lot of speed in his last couple races. And it seems like Strong Quality might get left alone on the front end. And sometimes we see those horses get brave. Now I'd need a big price, much bigger than even the 15-1 that he is on the morning line, probably in the 20s. But this is a horse who's done absolutely nothing wrong in his 2 turf races. And if he's just left alone to his own devices up there, he could get brave.
Yeah, we're on the exact same page in this race, Craig. I mean, we like the same horses, and I even think the interesting long shot is Strong Quality, though. I mean, I think I picked him 4th in this race. It's not like I'm making some big push for him, as neither are you. I will say, I think 1.25 miles is going to be even better for Strong Quality than his prior turf races, because he actually almost won going 1.25 miles on the dirt, which really takes some stamina. So he's got that box checked off. We'll just see if he can, number one, get to the front, and number 2, carry that speed against a field of this quality, because a sleeper potential pace setter in this race is the number 1 So High, whose connections, when they enter a horse in a big race like this, seem to like to get aggressive. And I would imagine the instructions to Javier Castellano are going to be, just send this horse to the lead and try to open up on the field. So that might, be a thorn in the side of a horse like Strong Quality. And it's a reason I ultimately didn't pick him higher in this race. So just something to, maybe pay attention to with the pace scenario. And Craig, let's finish up our discussion of this pick 5 sequence by talking about the feature race on Saturday. The Grade 1 Belmont Stakes, the final jewel of the Triple Crown. 1.5 mile distance, of course, around the Belmont Park Oval. And it's a really strong field. I mean, not only do we have some quality in the race, but I think that there are many directions to go, some favorites that look strong, some prices you can make cases for. Sure, there's no Triple Crown on the line, so you don't have that level of excitement to it, but it's a fun race to handicap.
It is. I tell you, after those first 4 races, maybe we just refer people to our video and wrap things up.
Getting tired, Craig?
I'm just kidding. No, I'm good. Yeah, but it's yet another very competitive race, I think. In the first place, I want to start is with the pace, because I posted the pace projector like literally the second it came out on the TimeformUS PPs, and a lot of people are surprised by the fast pace designation. But one thing to keep in mind is we're talking a fast pace for the 1.5 mile race on the dirt. So if you see a 48 or a 48-3, and you're used to watching, 1.16 or 1.125 races, and think that's kind of, moderate at best, that's not really the case in 1.5 miles. And if you're a Timeform US subscriber and you have the ability to look through the charts, just look through all the old Belmonts and you'll find a whole bunch of the races. The majority have fractions coded in red, because these horses aren't used to going that fast and they just can't turn it down to the ideal pace. So I won't be surprised if things get little hotter up front than what people expect.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And just because you have a couple of horses in here that it seems like there could be real intention to get them forward. Tappet Shoes, one of the 3 Brad Cox trainees, just feels like he's a horse that is probably in here to win the race. I'm not suggesting he's a rabbit with no chance, but I mean, just given the styles of the other two Cox runners, I mean, there's only upside to sending him forward because he seems to be doing better the more aggressive they get with him in recent starts. So he's probably one that goes forward from the inside. And I keep having trouble with this name. Il Miracolo seems like a horse that just based on his last race, when he went 45-1 to the half at Gulfstream in a one-turn mile, I mean, the fact that he seemingly randomly will possess that kind of speed and was successful showing it, you have to imagine his connections. If they're taking a shot in this race, they're probably going to take a shot trying to wire the field.
For sure. And I mean, I'm not sure what he's really doing in the race, but if he's going to be in it, you might as well go because that's how he's won his only two wins in his career, going wire to wire. And then we haven't even got to the Preakness winner who won that race, setting the pace, wire to wire all the way around the track. And it's not like he crawled, none of the fractions are in blue. He just kind of dictated things up front, going a good steady pace, and was able to hold off Blazing Sevens to the wire. And I can't imagine Bob Baffert would give instructions to change the running style here and try to have him come from off the pace when he's another who both career wins have come in wire to wire fashion.
Yeah, and National Treasure, I think that neither you or I are big fans of him in this race. I mean, different pace situation than the Preakness, and that Preakness overall just, was a depleted field. I mean, it lost a major player with first mission to a scratch, and it just was not the quality that we typically see in a Triple Crown race, and he just got the absolutely perfect trip controlling up front. I mean, even beyond the pace scenario, which I know the pace figures aren't, color-coded blue in TimeformUS, but when you watch the race, I really put emphasis on race flow, and it was just a total merry-go-round affair where nobody was really changing position. And I don't think he really necessarily showed stamina in that race as much as he showed speed to sprint to the wire in the final quarter, and I'm just not sure those attributes are really going to be an asset in the Belmont Stakes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not a fan of his in here either. So that said, I guess we should kind of start with who we do view as contenders and just kind of talk about the horses you have as the morning line favorites, the two Todd Pletcher horses, which I totally get given Todd Pletcher's success in the Belmont Stakes. I just wonder if they're going to offer any value either. I mean, Forte, we all know he was scratched on the day of the Derby. But he was a horse I came in not particularly liking that day anyway. He hadn't really shown any forward movement in his 3-year-old season off his really good 2-year-old form, where he was obviously the Eclipse Award winner. He won both his races. He beat the eventual Derby winner in Mage, but I have lingering doubts about Forte, and the layoff isn't going to do a whole lot to allay those. And then we have Tapit Trice, who is second choice at 3-1 on the morning line. He does seem more like a typical Todd Pletcher type Belmont horse. He's going to need to step up his speed figures. He was one I thought would step it up in the Kentucky Derby. He really didn't. He does have some quirks to his running. If he's going to take a step up, he would do it here in a race like the Belmont, but you're going to be taking a pretty short price to find out if you bet on him.
Yeah, we basically share the opinion on Forte. He's just not for me in this race. Like you said, I was not a fan of him in the Kentucky Derby, and I have to be even more against him here because he's got further hurdles to overcome. I mean, even going back to the conversation we were having ahead of the Kentucky Derby, we were unsure if he was a horse that was really progressing as a 3-year-old or if he just sort of, hit a plateau at the end of his 2-year-old season. I think that question is still lingering out there. We haven't gotten an answer since the Florida Derby. And, beyond that, he now has this layoff to overcome. He's coming into the Belmont Stakes after 10 weeks off, a mile and a half off the layoff. And I know Todd Pletcher has worked wonders off layoffs in the past, but this is sort of an unprecedented situation with this horse trying to win a race that's this demanding off that kind of break. So he's not for me, and it's not like he's a horse that has some profile to say he's supposed to love a mile and a half anyway. Tapit Trice, it's the opposite situation, of course, because he perfectly fits the profile of a Todd Pletcher trained Belmont Stakes winner, a horse that sort of disappointed in the Derby, but has the pedigree to go longer, physically, has that massive stride on him, just that, lanky, galloping type that looks like a Belmont Stakes horse by the Belmont sire Tapit. So, I mean, a lot of reasons to think the Tapit race is going to fit this race perfectly, but I feel like that's an opinion that everybody holds about this horse, that he's just going to do better in this race than he did in the Kentucky Derby, and I think it's all going to be built into his price. At the end of the day, like you said, he's still a horse that hasn't run that fast, and he still has that character trait where he can be a little lazy, and Luis Saez just has to ride him for every step of the races that he's in. I mean, go back and watch those last 3 races, and he's under a drive on the backstretch, he's under a drive on the far turn, and he's under a drive in the stretch. And can you really just be, after a horse, driving him for an entire mile-and-a-half race and expect to get the money? I don't know. I mean, it seems like he's just a quirky horse that I don't have enough faith in to take a short price on. And then we come to Angel of Empire, Craig, and, I mean, I agree. I just think he makes a lot of sense in this race. He probably, isn't... some people might downgrade him a little bit based on the fact that he was the beaten Derby favorite, and you can't really make an excuse for that race because he got such a similar trip to Mage and was beaten by that foe. But he just showed up once again with a good effort like he had in his prior starts, and he's been improving in every race. I'm doubtful that he can take another step forward going 1.5 miles, but he might not have to. My big question with Angel of Empire and the others coming out of the Derby, Craig, is that I know the Derby got a big speed figure from everybody, not just from you, from Beyer, from, representing a significant step forward for multiple 3-year-olds in that race. And maybe they all did improve, but, I do want to note that Mage, basically regressed by 10 points in the Preakness. He's the only run back from that race, I think, so far. And I just want to see some validation of that Derby speed figure, because even though the track seemed consistent on Derby day, fast-paced, 1.25 miles, it can be tough, to sort of group that races with the others. So I just want to see if that Derby was really as fast a race as it came up.
I think it was as fast, but I do think pace probably has something to do with that. The Derby probably gets inflated year in and year out because pace is a big part of final time. If you go fast, the faster you go early, usually the faster the race final time, not particularly the time of the horses that did the running early. And it set up the Derby for a fast time. So I have no argument with that. But Angel of Empire, he's good. I know when we both liked him in the Arkansas Derby, and we made the case that even though he came from way out of it in the Risen Star, we think he has more tactical speed when he needs it, and I think that'll serve him well. He's adding blinkers here in the Belmont. I don't think it's going to make a big difference, and I think he's a strong contender for sure. I don't see why he wouldn't run at one of his better races. He always shows up. He's ran a better speed figure every single time he stepped foot out on the track. He probably won't have to do that to win here, as you say. A 120s may be good enough to win. So I think he is one of the stronger contenders, and I definitely like him more than the 2 top Pletcher horses.
Yeah, I think the biggest argument in favor of Angel of Empire is that he probably is supposed to be the favorite in this race, and he might not be. So there could be a little bit of value there if you think that he's supposed to be around 3-1, like I do, and he's a little higher than that. So, I mean, I think there's a case to be made for Angel of Empire in this race, but there are also cases to be made for some bigger prices, Craig. And I know that both of us like some horses that are a little longer on my morning line. And, the new face in this group is number 3, Arcangelo, who obviously hasn't competed in the first 2 legs of the Triple Crown, but this horse is really coming around at the right time. And there are some signs that 1.5 miles could be right up his alley.
Yeah, he was a horse when he broke his maiden. The race kind of seemingly came out of nowhere at Gulfstream, got a huge speed figure that day. But I just really liked what I saw, and nothing in the Peter Pan changed that when he was able to beat Bishop's Bay. They ran away from the rest of the field in the stretch, and I thought his rider was a little overconfident. When you hear him interviewed, he said he just kind of knew he was going to win this race, and it kind of showed the way he rode him. There wasn't a lot of pace that day. He was able to overcome it, maybe with a little help from Bishop's Bay, who seemed to pull himself up a little bit. But everything I saw from Arcangelo that day told me that the 1.5 mile Belmont shouldn't be any problem from him. He certainly has the breeding to get the job done. It just feels like this was a race made for a horse like him.
Yeah, I mean, he fits the profile of a horse like Tonalist, who won this race in the past, who was coming in off a very similar series of races. The trainer really has not had a horse on a big stage like this before, so it's kind of new territory for Jenna Antonucci and the connections. But I mean, she's obviously managed this horse well. Like you were saying, the pedigree is definitely there. I mean, he's got, if you're the type that wants to dig deep in a female family, I think his second dam is a half sister to Rags to Riches and Jazzle, who were Belmont Stakes winners. So I mean, there are things to like there. I mean, from a speed figure standpoint, he didn't really step forward in the Peter Pan. He just kind of held his form. We'll see if he takes a step forward here. I did kind of feel like Bishop's Bay was supposed to beat him last time and would have if he had kind of kept his mind on running, but Arcangelo still was game to keep after him to the wire. So there's a case to be made for him. I would probably want a bigger price than I think he's going to be for me to endorse him, but I get the argument for Arcangelo. And then you've got another horse coming out of the Derby like Hit Show, who I can easily make a case for, Craig. I mean, he was closer to that fast pace than the other two coming out of the Derby, Tapatrice and Angel of Empire. He moved maybe prematurely on the far turn when he got all the way up into third, about the 3/8 pole, and then flattened out in the stretch. But it's not like he ever threw in the towel. He stayed on pretty well to finish fifth in that race, and he's another one that has just kind of been a little bit flying under the radar, but steadily improving, and he should work out the right kind of trip for mid-pack.
Yeah, I have no argument with Hit Show. Like we said, that I mean, this is a deep contentious racers. Probably only two horses, and they're the two longest shots in the field. That would shock me if they won. And Hit Show's another. I do wonder if he's kind of. I'm not even really sure what his running style is. I guess he's just kind of a mid-pack runner, and the way he flattened out a little in the Derby, albeit after being up close to a fast pace, gives me a little bit of concern. But he's going to offer some value for sure.
Yeah, and I'll make my push for my probably crazy pick in this race of the number 9 Red Route 1, who I get it. He's a little slow, but once I start to make that argument that I don't quite buy the Kentucky Derby speed figure, it brings down the threshold for winning this race a little bit. And when you start to compare Red Route 1 to the Tapatrices and the Arcangelos and even Forte and Hit Show, he's not running that much slower than those horses. And yes, he's been a little bit of a disappointment. Wanted to see a little more from him when he was closing at the end of the Arkansas Derby. Just got way too far back in the early stages of that race. But I liked that he showed a little more focus getting up to win that Bathhouse Row over some pretty good horses, maybe ones that are a little more distance challenged than he, but I mean, he got up that day. And then what I found most encouraging about Red Route 1 was in the Preakness last time, he just seemed to be way more engaged in the early stages of that race. Yeah, the pace was not fast, but I mean, even if you just look at this horse's pace figures, I mean, he was much closer than he usually is. And yeah, he didn't produce the same kick that we're used to seeing from him, but nobody could. I mean, that was a race that was just a total merry-go-round. Neither he or Mage could make up any ground at the end, and he was actually really trying in the stretch like he always does. When Rosario, really got into him in the final eighth, he was actually even making up a little of ground on Mage as they crossed the wire and was galloping out strongly. And this just strikes me as a horse. If there's anybody in this race that's going to love the distance, it's him. And it's not just because he's a deep closer, because that deep closers in the Belmont thing doesn't always work out. But this horse just has, he's so much stamina. His full brother, by Gunrunner, out of the damn Red House, is running earlier in the day in the Brooklyn. His name is Red Run. And just take a look at his past performances. He is a horse that was clearly inferior to Red Route 1 through most of his career, just kind of running mediocre speed figures on the dirt and the turf at conventional route distances. And they stretched him out to 1.5 miles on the dirt last time, and he was a different horse, nearly won a stakes race with a huge speed figure improvement, and just gives me some confidence that the distance is really going to work for this horse. And Joel Rosario, he rides this race well. He sprung upsets in the Belmont before. This guy reminds me a little bit of Sir Winston, who I liked in this race, and I'm getting that kind of vibe from him that he's just kind of not sexy, flying under the radar, but he's going to stay the trip. So, I'll put him on top at what's going to be a big price. I mean, he's just a horse that I don't see a lot of buzz around, so I think I'm going to get somewhere around that 15-1 morning line, and he's one that I would definitely use if I was playing this pick 5 sequence.
I can see it. I'm glad you mentioned running style because I wrote an article for DRF about the pace projector and the Belmont Stakes, like I do for all the Triple Crown races. And one thing you note when you go back through the history of the Belmont, particularly the last 10 or 15 years, is horses can come from anywhere. There's kind of a myth out there that deep closers don't do well, but some of them have done just fine. I mean, we've had deep closers win the Belmont. We've had horses win on the lead. We've had horses come from anywhere. So it doesn't seem to be a race that is suited by any particular running style. And the name's escaping me now, but didn't we recently see, or at least fairly recently see, a Steve Asmussen horse come from the clouds to win the Belmont Stakes?
We did. That was Creator, I think you're trying to think of,
Yes.
Craig. I mean, it was a bigger field in the Belmont, but that was one of the Belmonts where we saw an honest pace develop, and maybe he wasn't the best horse on that day. There's an argument that Destin, who set the pace or was up close to the pace, ran the better race as they hit the wire together. But Creator got the right trip and was able to, finish ahead of that one. And if you look back at that race, there's an argument that Joel Rosario maybe should have won that race on Governor Malibu, who got kind of one of the forgotten bad trips in that Belmont. But no, deep closers can definitely win this race. I did a separate analysis, I think, a couple years ago, just comparing the Belmont to the Preakness and kind of, assessing those long held beliefs that, the Preakness has a faster pace than the Belmont, and closers do well in the Preakness and speeds do well in the Belmont. And it's just not true. I mean, both races play fairly to running styles. We've seen varying pace situations in both races. So, we came to the same conclusion there.
Yeah. So another interesting race. I guess we can do a recap. As I said, it's very unlikely that I will play a pick five in here, but let's go ahead and close it out talking about some of our opinions in the races.
Yep, go for it, Craig.
All right, in the eighth, I'm kind of against Arabian Lion. That would be my big move, and maybe even General Jim and the Woody Stevens. I'm going to give Drew's Gold a shot, a horse I was so impressed with last time. He'd be a horse that I would key on in the Woody Stevens. In the Jaipur, I want to try to beat Caravelle. I just think Casa Creed's a better horse. He obviously loves the 6 furlong distance. He loves Belmont Park, so I'm going to give him a big chance, and I think he might slide under the radar a little bit again because of Caravelle. And I also expect a big race from Big Invasion. I think he's going to get back to more what we saw from his 3-year-old form. In the Met Mile, I get the argument that Repo Rocks may run his race. I'm looking more at he's not going to be able to back it up just like he wasn't last time. It's a grade one race, so I'm looking in a little bit different direction. I'm going to give Zandon a shot. I know the reservations you have about him, but it just seems like he wasn't well meant last time. He didn't get the greatest trip. I've always thought he'd be better around one turn. So I'm going to give him a chance in here. In the Manhattan, nothing too clever. I think up to the mark is really good. I don't think a stretch out to 1.25 miles is going to be any problem for him. He does have to deal with the two Charlie Appleby horses, but I actually think he's just better, and the speed figures kind of show that. So I think he's the one. And of the two Charlie Applebys, I, like you, prefer Warren Point a little bit to Ottoman Fleet if I was playing verticals. And I'm even going to give a little bit of a chance to Strong Quality to maybe steal it on the lead or chase the long shot you pointed out so high, who maybe he just runs off and Strong Quality kind of ignores him and sits in second. And maybe he gets brave once he takes the lead. And then we just covered the Belmont. My top pick would be Archangelo. There's a whole bunch of directions you could go. You've kind of talked me into using Red Route 1 and exotic bets. And my big takeaway in this race is I think the pace is going to be a lot hotter than what people think.
Yeah, I'll review as well, and the first two legs are so difficult. And the good news is, I think there's a pick four starting in race 9 if you get knocked out in the Woody Stevens, because that's a tough race to get through. I'm gonna try to go maybe a little thinner in there than a total spread, because there are some horses that I do like in this race. I mean, Fort Bragg, I think, is the most likely winner, so I've got to include him, especially if he's not favored. And the other horse for the same connections at a huge price, Fort Warren, who I did make my top pick in this race, just think he's going to offer significant value. He's supposed to get the right trip, so I'm going to key in on those two. I'll use horses like Victory Formation and Drew's Gold, and even General Jim, who just makes too much sense to exclude. But anybody else in here, I'd probably want to downgrade a little bit. There are just little negatives on each of them, and I don't see them offering the kind of value that I really want to get out of this race. So that I'll hope to get through with one of those five. In the Jaipur, the more I went through this race, I was kind of coming around to the idea that there's a decent chance that the pace is not going to be as hot as I initially thought. And I think Nothing Better is going to offer value. If anything, I think he could drift up from my 8-1 morning line. And he just seems like a horse that's going to run his race. So I want to include him prominently. Casa Creed, I think, most likely winner. I'll have him on my tickets. And Big Invasion, makes some sense. I could use him. And I also want to throw in that gigantic price as, Thin White Duke as more of a C type in a pick 5 wager, but primarily a horse that I'd want to play around with in exotics and intra-race wagers. In the Met Mile, I'm a little against Cody's Wish, and this is a difficult race from a pick 5 standpoint because you obviously are in really good shape for a nice payout if you're able to beat Cody's Wish, because he is going to be a horse that a lot of people single in this sequence. And I have enough of an opinion on others in here that I could potentially play a sequence where I leave him off completely and just try to go with the strategy of trying to defeat this horse. Even though I recognize he's a likely winner of this race, I just don't see the value being there. And I think I expect to get better value on horses like Charge It and Repo Rock. So I would want to key in on those two. If the ticket is looking more affordable than I'm anticipating, I could use Cody's Wishes like a B type to those A's, but I'll see how it all stacks up once I lay it out in terms of price. In the Manhattan, Craig and I are kind of on the same page here. I don't have a whole lot to add to what he said. I just think Up to the Mark is way the horse to beat. He'd be my lone A in this race. The two Charlie Appleby horses are hard to split from an ability standpoint, but I think Warren Point is going to offer the better value, so I could use him as my main backup in there. And then closing things out in the Belmont Stakes, I'm primarily interested in the 3 horses drawn in the farthest outside gates, Hit Show, Angel of Empire, and Red Route 1. And I think Red Route 1 is clearly the best value of those 3, so I would want to press him a little bit. But I think Angel of Empire is the most likely winner of the race. He's a safe horse to include on the tickets because I don't think he's going to offer bad value, and I think he really increases the chances of getting through the leg. So I would use him. And Hit Show maybe is more of a B type because I'm not as bullish on his chances, but I do think he's going to be the right kind of price in term relative to his chances of winning. Not an easy sequence, Craig, to say the least, but really fun races. We're going to see a lot of talented horses in action. So from multiple fronts, there's so much to look forward to on this Saturday card at Belmont Park.
Yeah, there is. And there's even races we didn't talk about. I know we did videos for the True North and the Poker video previews. Races which weren't in our sequence include the Brooklyn, which I'm always very thankful for as a speed figure maker, since it's at the same distance as the Belmont. And the Phipps is actually right before this sequence. And while it may not be the greatest betting race you'll ever see, and that's debatable, but we get to see yet another matchup between Clarier and Secret Oath. So not part of the pick 5 sequence, but quite the day of horse racing. And one as a speed figure maker, this is definitely my second favorite day, if not first, with the Breeders' Cup Saturday, because we always just get some really good performances because that's what it's going to take to win these races.
Yeah, there really is no dud on this Belmont Stakes Saturday card. If it's not a super competitive race like the Woody Stephens, it's got a real star in it, like some of the races early on in the day with Chez Pierre and Elite Power. And even that Phipps, Craig, I think is a super interesting race. I made my best bet of the day on DRF in there if you want to check out my picks there, or maybe I'll use this opportunity to plug the betting strategies that I'm doing with Mike Beer for this Belmont Stakes day, where we'll have analysis that's written out and some tickets for the entire day. So you can check that out and find more information about that on DRF.com. Craig, a lot of fun to talk about this sequence. I echo all of your sentiments about how much we anticipate this day and how much fun it is to take in the action on Saturday. So everybody, if you're playing a Belmont Stakes card this Saturday, good luck. Remember that you can always catch our TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch our recap of all this Belmont Stakes Day action when we come back with the TimeformUS Pacecast next week.